So, this is going to be the first video of this series where I go over Titanic theories and discuss with a neutral eye. The main goal of these videos is to put aside everything and be left with just the theory and the evidence. But I want to go over a breakup discussion to kick off the series, and that is the V-break theory. This may be a controversial video, as the V-break has been covered multiple times in the past, but I hope with a neutral way we will be looking at this, it would make it different and hopefully more civil. To kick off the theory, I want to say something to the main participant in this theory, who would be Aaron 1912. He has had a rough time recently with people outright attacking him for his views, but this does annoy me. However, if Aaron 1912, if you are watching this, or even if you just see the part of this video, I want to put forward an offer to have a one-on-one discussion with me to discuss the theory and get a bit more of the personal view on your side of the story. I want to be civil and treat each other with respect if we can talk. So I hope this is intriguing. If you wish to get in contact, there will be a way in the description to get in touch. But by all means, let's look at the theory now. I'm going to cite the theory from a video of Aaron 1912's, as it is the most recent and the one of the shortest. I'm going to take 3 steps with this and all the theories after. I'm going to look at the evidence provided or found, debate the possibility of the meaning of the quotes, and then dive into the physics. The video goes straight into the account quoting survivor Claire Annie Cameron.
She just broke in two and the ends were sticking up. She just broke in two and the ends were sticking up.
Cameron talked about the ends sticking up after the break, which is quite interesting and originally stumped me. Cameron was born in 1877, who grew up in Hampshire, England, moving to London for work as a housemaid, taking up residency where she worked. She sailed on the Titanic because she believed England was not enough for her, and subsequently wanted to find something better in America. Boarding the Titanic as a second-class passenger, she survived by getting into boat 14 on the fateful night. She had a private account on the April 29th, where she discussed what she witnessed. The whole quote says, "We got about 2 miles from the Titanic and watched her sink. She just broke in two and the ends were sticking up for about 5 minutes." It is an interesting quote, but something I found also interesting is a word they used back there. The word ends with the S at the end refers to the furthest part of anything. The ends of a horse, the ends of a bike, the ends of a ship. It wasn't only the word ends that added the S. The added S was what explained what part of the structure was being referred to. Instead of saying the forward end or the aft end, they would say the ends, which referred to the back section of Titanic, for instance. It was not slang in a sense, it was just a word that was more common at the time, like Juliet saying "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" Today we see that as her pondering over the location of Romeo, using the word "wherefore." However, in the 15th century it was translated as "Why are you Romeo?" The quote itself is actually good evidence for the stern going vertical after the break. As we discussed, Cameron is most likely referring to the far end of the ship. This case for stern/poop deck mentioned that it's sticking up for 5 minutes, which is supported by other evidence, particularly a line from Lawrence Beasley, who estimated the stern to stick up 150 feet out of the water, which would be the forward end of the aft well deck to the peak of the poop deck. The next quote is from Carrie Chaffee, told on April 23rd.
"First the middle seemed to go down, lifting bow and stern into the air."
This is also one which states for evidence for a V-break. Carrie is an American lady, so when she says bow and stern, we know she is genuine, and not the English plural confusion. She begins the quote starting at the plunge, it seems, most likely after the second funnel fell. And she talks about the ship suddenly righting. I say suddenly as she describes the ship's motion being steadier before the plunge. The ship sank steadily until just at the last. Right is defined as a twisted motion, which puts forward maybe the ship twisted just before the break. The next part is worded a little odd, starting, first the middle seemed to go down, lifting the bow and stern into the air, then twisted the other way, throwing the middle up. It seems to indicate that the ship broke in the middle, and the middle sank first, lifting the bow and stern as the middle sinks. but after the twisting the middle seemed to rise up again. Seems a bit odd, but maybe the middle detached and found a bit of buoyancy. But that isn't the main purpose of the quote. The main thing of the quote is lifting the bow and stern into the air. I want to put forward my thoughts after hearing this. Titanic today, in which lies on the bottom of the ocean, is referred to by the pieces it is in, the main ones being the bow and the stern section. The bow and stern referring to the two halves of the ship. I think Carrie is referring to the aft end of the bow, rising a bit after the break, but I could be wrong. I'm not going to lead on assumption though, and I'm going to give this theory the quote, as you have to assume to go against the context in the theory. The next quote is from John Snyder, an American survivor escaping a Boat 7. He was a first-class passenger returning from Europe Titanic after his honeymoon, with his new wife Nellie Stevenson.
The Titanic was torn in two. For a moment the great masses of steel and iron poised in the air, then slowly they sank.
There isn't much for the V-break with this one except for the use of the plurals for masses of steel and the pronoun of they, but I think the use of words masses just refers to the ship itself, as ships were commonly described as hunks of steel, to quote one, so I think he used the same type of explanation, and I think the word they is a follow on the plural, as the masses refers to multiple things from being plural, so you have to use the noun to follow up on. I am inclined to give the theory this one, again being on assumption. Not for using the word masses, but for using the word they. I stand by what I said, but it isn't really anything I could follow up on, so I'll give this theory that quote. Next we have a quote from May Futurillis.
The bow, which had been pointing downwards, dipped, turned up again, writhed, and sank with the stern, exactly as though one had stepped on a worm.
The quote is reasonable, talks about the bow pointing down, and then the bow came up again. I presume the aft end of the bow, twisting a little, then sank. Seems all jolly and well, but then there's the worm. This did confuse me and I couldn't explain the worm. The rest of it seems to be fine, but the worm makes it sound weird, but I couldn't fully explain it. The only thing I thought of is the stern rose high in the air and the aft end of the bow lifts as the stern falls, and the third funnel deck housing detaches, having the middle fall. In this case it looks like it has been stepped on, but the worm has two ends. I will put the point to the theory with this quote, but I stand by what I think with this quote, but I can't argue with it. Following that we have Thomas Ockenham, who was in Boat 13 with the likes of Frederick Barrett and Lawrence Beasley.
When the big ship parted, the halves seemed to rise out of the water, gaining impetus for the great trip to the bottom.
The quote starts with the break, as it states, when the big ship parted. It talks about the sections drifting apart, but for the next quote I have to state that Thomas was also English, born in Birmingham, similar to Mrs. Cameron, which is significant because he also uses the word halves. If we apply the same thing we did with Mrs. Cameron saying ends, we can propose he is referring to the back half of the ship, using the plural to indicate the rear section. So with that, he can be referring directly to the stern, as he then talks about the ship gaining impetus, defined as a driving force. But with that I have to then assume again, but the way people, or at least English people, spoke was slightly different to now, and it is starting to show a bit with these two accounts. It isn't stated who the next quote, but here it is.
The forward end, the bow, elevated at an angle high out of the water, floated for a few minutes and then disappeared, while the stern section rose out of the water as if it had been hinged and stood at right angles to the sea.
From what it sounds like, the text was written or spoken by a journalist who talked to some survivors, who I'm not sure. But again, it refers to the bow elevating at an angle high out of the water. The wording refers to the forward end rising, but it then talks about staying afloat, something other survivors with similar stories didn't mention. But this alone gives me the ability to give the point to the theory, as it is clear as day. But I'm not going to necessarily take this into consideration with the conclusion, as it is not taken from a survivor directly. A quote directly from a newspaper article stating as followed.
He said, "The bow sank, and then rose in the air. Then came a third boiler explosion. The ship buckled amidships and sank."
taking the second paragraph begins to talk about the bow rising in the air, but continuing the paragraph, I am not sure it is after the breakup. Seems to be more before, as it refers to there being another boiler explosion and then the ship buckling amidship. I am not going to give this point of the theory on the slimmest margin, due to it seemingly not referring to the breakup. Testimony from Patrick Dillon was next in the video.
The bow seemed to bob up and then break clean off, like a piece of carrot.
Dillon was a trimmer on the ship, and seemed to spend most of it sinking in the lower decks, due to a statement in the previous quote saying, "We shall have to jump for it, as all the boats are gone." Dillon refused to jump, and stayed on the ship until the very last moment. The main quote is another one that was published from another person's words. I wouldn't give the theory a point for this, but I do want to address the quote to be fair. It is an interesting piece of text, but I think there is again some confusion. As the article states, he stood on the poop, which was at a slope at about 60 degrees. The bow seemed to bob up and break clean off like a piece of carrot. To me, it looks like the wording is wrong with the use of bow, as if Dillon is on the poop deck, as it is going vertical at 60 degrees, then how would he notice the movement of the other half of the ship? I will assume for the most part that he is trying to hold on to the railing he states he was holding on to. We gripped the rail, and the next thing I remember, oh, it's awful. But with this, even though I am assuming, we know where Dillon was, and it seems the reporter may have got mixed up. But still, I won't give the point to the theory for it being a bit contradictory.
When the water got into the engine room, there was an explosion, and then I saw the Leviathan part in the middle. The stern rose high in the air, the bow less high.
Susan Weber, who got off the ship in Lifeboat 10, seemed to have come up to the theory herself that the water entering the engine room caused a loud explosion noise, which broke the ship in two. The main part we are going to look at states that the stern rose high while the bow was less high. Susan was from England but doesn't have the same use of adding the S at the end of the word. With this, the stern is self-explanatory, but the bow rising less high isn't interesting. I can assume she is referring to the aft end of the bow section, using the word bow, without the S to refer to the section and not the forwardmost part of the ship. Even with my confidence in that, I won't argue and say that the point goes towards the theory on the smallest margin. Next we have Richard Norris Williams, who has an upsetting story as he lost his father as they were about to jump in the water, never seen him again, like many others who lost their fathers that night.
With explosions, the ship seemed to break in two, and the forward end bounded up again for an instant.
Richard was on the forward end of the ship. I couldn't find it where exactly, but I presume may have been around the gymnasium, from how he refers to others being around him. Richard clearly states he saw the forward end rise for an instant, which is a light term I can't argue with. This coincides with others, like Eugene Daly for instance, who says he felt the deck come up under from him. But now hearing the explosion, I think he may have jumped just before the first funnel fell, and may have been further forward, but not too much further. I'm still going to give the point to the theory, but I think Richard is referring to a different part of the sinking. After this, there is Lucille Silverin, who was 17 years old and Finnish. This is another piece of quote from another person, but the quote is so short and she says it must be known that I will treat as a direct quote.
The Titanic broke in half and both ends turned up.
There it is, the words ends again. Even though she's not from England, she adds the S to the end of the word, end. Even though it can lean for the theory, I'm going to give the theory it just on the smallest margin, as I do not feel it's as impactful as other quotes. I'm not going to cover any more of the survivors due to not wanting this video to be hours long, but I'm going to hopefully possibly do a live stream about this if you wish to see it, and if you do, please write a comment and I will plan it as quickly as I can. But now I'm going to go into the physics part of the discussion. video goes straight into the double bottom section at the wreck site, showing one of the whip sides of the section. This image was taken of the aft section from the double bottoms, so the part that would be attached to the stern. And I think there's a little mix up. The video states that this is the side that was between both sections, but actually from a mosaic of the piece and analysis of the piece is found to be from the side that was attached to the stern and not the forward double bottom section. Here are some more images of the area. You can see the keel being bent upwards. If the keel was right way up, it explains that the keel may have been bent upwards into the ship, or it could simply be decay. But other images of the section on the other side surprisingly straight or bent a bit upwards. But the section has lost a lot of its forward plating, so it's hard to tell the bending of those plates. But I'm going to be a little nitpicky here. Maybe with revision stuff can be explained, but I wanted to point out that if the bow rose from the tip, I don't know how the keel could bend like that so drastically if it's on the middle side of the section. I don't want to come off as aggressive, but it's something that stumped me when I looked at this point of the theory, but maybe a simple explanation will help, you never know. This is an interesting point, but I hate to say it falls short due to pretty much all doors except watertight doors weren't watertight. Like most doors today, there are small gaps on the underside of the door to allow the door to swing open without dragging or getting stuck. Same with the side of the door, it isn't a true seal. There are little gaps on the sides when the doors are closed, so a gap of a few millimeters there is to allow the latch to lock in place every time. But I want to comment on the doors further, because the doors commonly for Titanic open into the room. So as the water starts to flood, it will begin to push against the door. The higher the water, the more force the door has to go through before it opens. On E-deck, for instance, at the wreck, where there are doors, they are open. This is something that intrigued me a lot, as the idea of the foxhole going under was never truly discussed. But now the video states that the water coming over the bow would flow down to E-deck and pour into the boiler rooms, which I can understand, but looking at Titanic's layout causes issues. The forward hatches from C to F deck were surrounded by steps that go up or down for different decks at the forward end of the ship. I'm going to quickly state, but put aside after, that if the ship was gaining air pockets, the cabins from F deck upwards, it would stop the ship from sinking, as the ship would have so much air in it that it can't physically sink further. It will probably be close, but it will continue to float. But I will set that aside. The water rushing into the hatches will break the canvas for hatch 2 and 3, but will probably seep in for hatch 1. But that being said, what confuses me is that if the water can go from the hatches to E-deck, then what is restricting them from going to other places, like further forward to flood those areas? But it's something that I couldn't understand. As for this, I do think water flooding Scotland Road will flood the rest of the boiler rooms, but still quite slow. I think this little animation is to show the reversing of the list from starboard to port. Forensics contribute to the water in Scotland Road pulling the ship to a port list, but from survivor testimony the ships seem quite stable and no one noticed the list until the final plunge. Okay, this is messing with my brain a little. I am confused as the bow would be shallow or under the water, so the head trim of the ship would allow gravity the lowest part it can, which would be forward. If the ship was on an even keel, I would give this as good evidence, as the shear from the ship would pull the water to amidship, but the Titanic had a 1 meter 25 centimeter shear from centre to bow, which isn't massive enough to cause the water to flow to the centre at a 6-degree forward list the ship had when the bow started to go under. But I think the idea is that the water entered from the hatches and flooded boiler room 4 and 3, but the problem with this is that it wouldn't make the midship heavier, due to the forward compartments of the cargo room, holds and the boiler room 6 and boiler room 5 already being flooded. It is sadly a miss for the theory, but it was quite an interesting argument. The comment of the bulkheads falling is something that is mentioned by the odd few from people, but I don't think any of the bulkheads failed. If you look at the bow section of the ship, it is standing tall with a slight sag around the superstructure and the middle of the forecastle, and the bulkheads are one of the main supports of the ship to stay strong, and after 100 years later the Titanic is still standing strong, except for the brake area, but the brake was at the bulkhead, so I'm not counting that. But I don't think the bulkhead collapsed in the bow during the sinking. It's the same with the boilers. I don't think the explosions survivors talked about were boiler implosions, except for boiler room 2, showing slight implosion damage on the aft faces. But I think that was the area of the break when water suddenly rushed into the room during descent as the pressure builds. This is something that I recently thought about. The vent in question is an air intake in front of the first funnel. For the longest time I thought the vent went to the boiler room, but I found that it goes to a generator on F deck. But what always confused me is the burst of hot air that lie hollow states. I think it might have been the water rushing into the vent pushing the air up that is still in the ship. But again, F deck would have been flooded at this time, but I think the hot air was mainly just it being hotter than the water or the air around him. But I don't think it was a boiler explosion, because the boiler room that shaft is above is over boiler room 6, which has been flooded for hours by now. And I don't think it was any of the boilers further aft, because the air would not be able to go from the boiler room 3, for example, to the area of the shaft due to the watertight doors being closed. And the one between boiler room 4 and 5, that was open to get the pumps into the boiler room 5, which they closed by the water activating the float failsafe at the stokehold plate, which was a trip system that unlatched the door and the door would descend. Even though I can't disagree with this point, I do want to put forward that the engines themselves probably had little effect on the actual sinking of the stern, considering, well, the entire engine room was open. But when the engine room flooded, it would have pulled the stern down enough to where it also got to the upper decks and started to flood them as well, and so that contributes to how the ship went vertical. I'm going to skip the part of the ship breaking into 3, as I wish to discuss this in a different video. The ship breaking into 3 isn't only for the V-brake, but the evidence is there to support it. But as we are looking at the V-brake, I am going to skip this part. When I saw the use of thermal stress, I first had no idea what it was, and then I was just astonished. After I watched multiple Indians explaining thermal stress to me, it felt unworthy, like it is something to consider, but when you think about it, it just falls apart. To give a basic explanation, when a metal or anything, in this case steel, gets hot, it slightly expands and the atoms get more bouncy, and when the metal gets cold, it shrinks. I do want to say now though, as a change so small, it can't be observed with the naked eye. And thermal stress happens when a material is unable to expand or shrink, making the atoms go haywire and go rogue, causing considerable damage. But this is where I sadly lost hope with the explanation. The best time for the ship to be under thermal stress is actually when the ship is steaming at full speed undisturbed in the Atlantic, or any piece of cold water, as the metal on one side is very cold while the other side is very hot. The collision allows the water to come in and flood the boiler rooms, or even the cargo holds, would come in and equalize the steel atomically. And yes, I want to emphasize that this is happening on an atomic level, so thermal stress is already being acted upon by the ship before the collision. This part is again reasonable until you dive into it, and then you discover a large flaw with this. First, I want to address the twisting of the ship. From survivors, the lift was very gradual and hard to notice. It wasn't until ADEC started to go under that passengers were asked to move to the starboard side, but there were two reasons for that. First, there were more boats on the port side, so I presume those saw a better chance on that side than the other side. But the order was because the collapsible was on the davit. It was swinging a bit far from the ship for a safe transfer, so the officer who requested asked if the men could move to the starboard side and the women stayed with the children. This didn't do much. The ship's list is testified to have gotten even worse after this, which shows the passengers had little effect on the balance of the ship. But now I'm going to talk about the open porthole situation, and unfortunately it is a contradicting argument. First, I will say from observation of the wreck, only an estimate of 5 portholes were found open on the port side, not counting the ones in the crumple zone under the well deck. But even if the portholes did flood, it does cause a problem. A while earlier I discussed the topic of the cabins not filling with water and creating air pockets which allow the bow to rise back up. But I think you can see the problem. If all the portside portholes were open, that would mean that the cabins would fill to the brim with water and nothing can stop the water. So the bow can't rise back up, as these air pockets now don't exist, and the bow would now have less buoyancy. I don't think this part of the theory was well thought out, unfortunately, as you can't have one and the other. One of these points needs to be dismissed for the theory to have some leeway. We go back to some survivor testimony of the rolling of the ship. Mary Glynn said the ship bobbed like a cork and finally Titanic seed rolling. Seems to hesitate for a moment and plunged her bow into the ocean. Mary was in boat 13, so she was roughly 3 kilometers away, or nearly 2 miles away. Hugh Woolner again talks about the ship rocking a little. Using the words a little bit was interesting. To me shows that it wasn't like a boat rocking like in a canal. The video cites someone named Miss Reniff, but from finding the article led to the survivor called Lillian Renoff, so I think this is a spelling error from the site of the journal. The quote says, "The big boat could be seen. She parted in the middle. There was an awful roar followed by an explosion. The whole steamer seemed to rock and steady herself for a final plunge. This to me is clearly after the breakup." Lillian talked about the stern after the break, probably trying to right herself and find buoyancy, which was lost pretty quickly until she was documented to go vertical. I will dismiss this quote just because it isn't referring to a pre-breakup movement. I'm going to combine the next 2 quotes as they use a similar term being tremble. Archibald Gracie and William Mellor described the ship trembling. Mellor continued to say he was swept by the wave and was on the side of the collapsible. So I think they were talking about the same movement. This seemed to be as the bridge was going under, from what Mellor talks about. But the word tremble isn't violent. This leads me to think it was more of a slight vibration that went through the ship, maybe metal strain or the ship being unhappy from the rapid sinking. Now we have Lightoller, who says the ship seemed to be heaving tremendous sighs as she went down. Sighs are a deep breathful expression, which puts me on the side that Lightoller was feeling something from deep inside the ship. Again, maybe ship strain from the water. But then I don't sit well with it being boiler explosions. To put it brief, I only believe Boiler Room 2 was used coming to the final moment, being abandoned and left at around 2 AM from testimony. I want to go into the topic more, but I have this planned for a video in the future, so I won't dive into that now. And again, we have a quote from Lightoller stating, "The ship took a dive, reeling for a movement then plunging." Reeling is defined as winding something in, like a fishing rope, or losing one's balance. I think Lightoller is referring to the latter, as it would be quite strange and inappropriate for him to be fishing in such a moment. This seems to be right before the ship plunges, acting as the definition states, the ship just lost balance and felt like it is falling, pausing for a moment, then plunging as stated. I will say now, the animation is a bit overdramatic, but I want to comment on something a bit nitpicky, so please excuse me. But the animation shows two sections, the bow being pushed forward and appearing to point downwards with its forward momentum, and one where the stern seemed to be pushing the bow up. I don't think you can have a version with both these scenarios. I am not going to comment on the rest, as it is just illustration of the theory from different angles, and we are left with a nice true message that we should indeed not forget those who perished that night and those who had to live with the nightmare for the rest of their lives. But I will give my conclusion now. I'm not going to agree with this theory for 3 reasons. 1, the theory does not account all the evidence that there is, with a lot of the survivor testimony not acknowledged, with some discussing a different part of the sinking being used in different contexts. 2, there are moments in the theory that contradict themselves, mainly the porthole part, and the centre of the ship gets heavier with the water when the forward compartment is known to be flooded. 3, the physics behind the theory is just beyond impossible. And I'm not saying that as an aggressive tone, and I'm not saying that in light of just everyone else. I'm just saying that it doesn't stack up, it doesn't make sense, and it's just a bit wonky in places. I do hope that some revisions can possibly be made, and I will be more than happy to look at it again, but for now the physics that are behind the theory are just pretty impossible. Even though the theory is unique and has a few things that give it leeway, it falls short due to the full scale of it, from the rest of the survivor testimony that were not mentioned to the forensics. It is a theory that sadly seems to have gotten a wrong impression. With its unlikeliness, it has been a very controversial topic in the Titanic community, going as far as giving pure harassment to those who follow it, like Aaron 1912. I think the vulgar way people approach the theory is shameful, and those who go at the theory aggressive should feel ashamed of themselves. You can disagree with it all you like, but don't try to be the superior figure, calling others names like someone with Tourette's. And with this, I hope the theory can be somewhat accepted as an existing theory. Agree with it or not, don't try to discuss it if you don't agree with it. Leave it alone and focus on your own theory or anything else for that matter. I may do a live stream about the longer video that is 45 minutes long. If you wish to see that, then let me know and I'll make it happen. But to end this, I want to keep my offer to Aaron 1912 for a one-on-one discussion about Titanic herself and the theory, and get your side on this, from how you feel about Titanic herself. If you want to get in touch, there are ways in the description. And from me and those behind the channel, thank you for watching.